God made a promise that would echo through generations and shape the destiny of a people. He promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob a land of their own. This was not just any land, but a land chosen by God himself, a land that would become the cradle of a great nation. This land was Canaan, a land flowing with milk and honey. It was a place of abundance, where the soil was fertile and the streams ran clear and pure. It represented God's blessing and favor. The promise of Canaan was a symbol of hope and a future filled with prosperity and joy. God's people, the Israelites, were chosen to inherit this promise. They were a people set apart, destined to fulfill a divine purpose. They embarked on a journey to the promised land. This journey was not just a physical trek, but a spiritual pilgrimage, a test of faith and endurance. This journey was not easy. The path was fraught with difficulties, and the desert was harsh and unforgiving. They faced many challenges and hardships. From the scorching heat of the day to the freezing cold of the night, their resolve was constantly tested. But God was with them. His presence was a constant source of comfort and strength, guiding them through the darkest times. He provided for their needs and guided their steps. Manna from heaven, water from the rock, and his word through the prophets sustained them. He chose Moses to be their leader, a man who spoke with God face to face. Moses was not just a leader, but a mediator, a shepherd guiding his flock towards their divine inheritance. Moses was a remarkable leader. He stood up to Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, and demanded the release of his people. He led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. With God's help, he parted the Red Sea, allowing his people to walk through on dry ground. Moses was a faithful servant of God. He listened to God's voice. He followed God's commands. He interceded for his people. He was a shepherd, guiding his flock towards the land of promise. Moses was celebrated as the leader of the Exodus, the figure through whom God delivered his people from Egyptian slavery. God entrusted Moses with the law, and Jesus revealed that Moses foreshadowed his own work as the Messiah. See John chapter 3, verse 14 and 15. Moses is also recognized in Hebrews 11 as a model of faith. In Deuteronomy 34, we learn that God himself buried Moses. It is said, "Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel." Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 10 and verse 12. Despite these remarkable achievements, Moses was not permitted to enter the promised land. Why was this? Let's explore this. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 51 and 52, God gives the reason that Moses was not permitted to enter the promised land. "This is because you broke faith with me in the presence of the Israelites at the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the desert of Zin, and because you did not uphold my holiness among the Israelites. Therefore you will see the land only from a distance. You will not enter the land I am giving to the people of Israel." God was true to his promise. He showed Moses the promised land, but like God promised, he did not let him enter in. The incident at the waters of Meribah Kadesh is detailed in Numbers chapter 20. As the Israelites neared the end of their 40 years of wandering, they arrived in the desert of Zin, where they found themselves without water and began to complain against Moses and Aaron. In response, Moses and Aaron went to the tent of meeting and fell down before God. God instructed them to gather the assembly and speak to the rock, promising that water would flow from it. Instead, Moses, seemingly frustrated, addressed the people as rebels and struck the rock twice with his staff. Numbers chapter 20, verses 10 and 11. Moses, in a moment of anger and frustration, disobeyed God's specific instructions. He failed to uphold God's holiness before the people. This act had severe consequences. Water did indeed come from the rock as God had promised. However, God immediately told Moses and Aaron that because they had failed to trust him fully and honor him as holy, they would not lead the Israelites into the promised land. God declared that Moses would not enter the promised land. He would not see the fulfillment of the promise. His disobedience, though seemingly small, had cost him dearly. The punishment might seem severe to us, but if we take a closer examination of Moses' actions, it would reveal several mistakes. Most notably, Moses disobeyed a direct command from God. God had instructed Moses to speak to the rock, but instead Moses struck the rock with his staff. Previously, when God provided water from a rock, he had told Moses to strike it, Exodus chapter 17. However, the instructions were different this time. God wanted Moses to demonstrate trust in him, especially after their long-standing relationship. Moses did not need to use force. He simply needed to follow God's command and trust in his promise. Moses, by striking the rock instead of speaking to it, did not accurately represent God to the Israelites. He acted in anger and frustration, not in faith and obedience. In doing so, it was a failure to reflect God's holiness. This act undermined God's authority and tarnished the image of God's holiness before the people. God is holy, set apart and perfect. He cannot tolerate sin. He demands obedience from his people. Additionally, Moses took credit for bringing forth the water. He addressed the people at the rock by saying, "Must we bring you water out of this rock?" Numbers chapter 20 verse 10, implying that he and Aaron were responsible for the miracle rather than attributing it to God. This act of claiming credit publicly could not go unpunished, as it misrepresented God's holiness to the Israelites. The rock that provided water is symbolically linked to Christ in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 4. The rock was struck in Exodus chapter 17 verse 6, paralleling Christ's single crucifixion, see Hebrews chapter 7 verse 27. Moses' command to speak to the rock in Numbers 20 might have been intended as a representation of prayer. Just as Jesus was struck once and continues to offer living water to those who pray in faith, Moses' act of striking the rock disrupted this typology and, in a sense, re-crucified Christ. Moses faced a severe punishment for his disobedience, pride, and misrepresentation of Christ's sacrifice. He was barred from entering the Promised Land, Numbers chapter 20, verse 12. Despite this, Moses did not complain about his punishment, but continued to lead the people faithfully and honor God. Despite Moses' disobedience, God remained faithful to his promise. In his holiness, God also showed compassion. He did not abandon the Israelites in the wilderness. He did not rescind his promise of the land flowing with milk and honey. He invited Moses to Mount Nebo and allowed him to see the promised land before his death. Deuteronomy chapter 34 verses 4 and 5 recounts, "Then the Lord said to him, 'This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it.' And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said." Despite Moses' failure at the rock, it did not sever his relationship with God. God continued to use and tenderly love his prophet. God chose Joshua, Moses' successor, to lead the people into the promised land. Moses' story teaches us that God is holy and demands obedience. It shows us that even the greatest leaders are not exempt from the consequences of disobedience. But it also reminds us of God's unwavering faithfulness and his desire to bless us. As we journey towards our own spiritual promised land, let us remember the lessons from Meribah: to trust God completely, to obey him wholeheartedly, and to never lose sight of the promises he has made to us.